Hi folks, thanks for joining me today. In this video, you'll learn everything you need to know about making your own substrate for mushroom cultivation. As they say, you are what you eat, and that means you are also what you eat eats. Nourishing mushroom food and potent medicine begin with a lovingly and well-prepared substrate. Now, different mushrooms have different needs, and different substrates require different approaches. So when we try to mix and match, we often run into problems. Today, in addition to offering some basic recipes and preparations, I hope to clear up some common confusion by explaining some of the underlying concepts, giving you the tools to help you help your mushrooms thrive. In the first part of this video, I'll be explaining some of the important concepts that apply to all mushroom substrates to help you determine which ingredients, proportions, and preparations are the right fit for your mushroom cultivation ambitions, budget, and level of experience. In the second part of this video, I'll be taking a deep dive into wood-loving mushroom substrates, covering a variety of possible ingredients and recipes and offering some tips for mixing and cooking. In the third part, I'll be covering substrates for compost and dung-loving mushrooms, and we'll take a step out into the pasture to see about wrangling up some top-shelf poops. As usual, I'm going to try not to leave anything out, so this video is chock full of information, some serious geekery, and plenty of tips and tricks. So use the chapter markers to skip ahead to the section of interest, check out the description for some basic cut and dried recipes, or just sit back, relax, and take it all in.
Now listen up, you scallywags. If you're new to mushroom cultivation, you better find your sea legs before you go plunging into the briny deep. Now, the best course to get yourself ship-shape is to start with a liquid culture syringe and some pre-cooked substrate and grain. But don't let some freebooter hornswaggle you into buying their scurvy rations. Do yourself a favor and try an all-in-one grow kit from yours truly over at Fungaia.life, made lovingly with organic ingredients. And inoculate it using a dram of the golden nectar from our hearties over at TrueBlueGenetics.org, where you'll find the finest plunder this side of the Siam. And don't forget, tell 'em 'twas Captain Blogar who sent you with the coupon code BLAGAR for 20% off your order.
Once you have a few grows under your belt and you're ready to move on to more advanced techniques, making your own mushroom substrate is a beautiful way to save a buck while also deepening your connection with your fungus. As I'll explain in much more detail in my upcoming video on mushroom cultivation basics, the vast majority of mushrooms that we would want to grow can be loosely grouped into two categories. We've got the wood lovers, things like shiitake, lion's mane, oyster mushrooms, the primary decomposers of hardwood. And then we've got the compost-loving fungi, which include those very special varieties with a particular preference for manure. I will mention that there's another category which has been growing in popularity, and that's the cultivation of the entomopathogenic fungus Cordyceps militaris, which grows on insects. I won't be discussing it at all in this video, but I will slip a little Cordyceps substrate recipe in the description for those of you who are interested. Once you've determined which of these categories applies to the type of mushroom that you want to grow, you'll need to decide how you want to treat that substrate to get it ready for your fungus. The most common method is steam sterilization, which involves using a pressure cooker or an autoclave to heat the substrate hot enough that it eliminates all living organisms, leaving a blank slate for your fungus. However, this also leaves more room for pathogens or other uninvited guests, which means that a lot more care and precision is needed throughout the entire growing process. Steam sterilization is by far the most reliable method for treating substrates, but it's also the most resource and labor intensive. An alternative to total sterilization is pasteurization. Pasteurization aims at reducing microbial populations, especially the spores of undesirable fungi like mold, while keeping some of the microbiome alive. For some mushroom varieties like dung-lovers, pasteurization is actually the best option, whereas for others you'll definitely want to sterilize the substrate if you can. There are other treatment methods as well, such as superpasteurization, which is a good alternative to sterilization, or fractional pasteurization, which involves pasteurizing at low temperatures multiple times to achieve similar results. There's also such a thing as cold pasteurization, which I'll hope to explain in a future video. As with all things in mushroom cultivation, there are no hard and fast rules here, and if you really want to, you could try just doing nothing at all and hoping that it works. That said, there are certainly better and worse choices for each application, and it's well worth taking the time to do your research ahead of time and save yourself a lot of trouble later on. Many of the early failures of mushroom cultivators are the result of trying to mix and match incompatible varieties, ingredients, and techniques. I'll offer some roadmaps to these techniques in my upcoming Introduction to Mushroom Cultivation, and I also have a video on pressure cookers, sterilization, pasteurization, and tyndallization, which may answer any other questions that you have. But for now, let's move on and talk about some basic substrate concepts. There are a few basic principles that apply to all mushroom substrates that I think are really helpful to understand. A perfect mushroom substrate has plenty of moisture, a good balance of carbon and nitrogen, a balanced pH, and a good amount of structure to allow the mycelium to find its way through. The most important of all is water, so let's start there.
It's the most precious substance in the universe.
Mushrooms are as much as 95% water, so the amount of moisture in your substrate is the #1 factor for determining its potential yield. Getting a good feel for moisture content is a must. If the substrate is too dry, the mycelium may focus on conserving water. It might form a dense outer layer like a skin to trap moisture, which will prevent mushrooms from being able to push through. This is called overlay, and it's a real problem for a lot of newcomers. If mushrooms do form, they're often sparse, small, or underdeveloped. On the other hand, if the substrate is too wet, most of that moisture will start to pool up in the lower reaches of the substrate, causing low oxygen or anaerobic conditions that will prevent the mycelium from growing properly and give bacteria a strong competitive advantage. The goal is to find that sweet spot where the substrate is fully saturated but still dry to the touch. A perfect fungal paradox, we want it to have as much moisture as possible without ever getting soggy. The maximum amount of moisture that soil or substrate can hold is called the field capacity, and this will vary significantly depending on the materials involved. We can significantly increase the field capacity of our substrate and therefore our potential yield by adding specific ingredients for this purpose. One of the most common of these is vermiculite, which is just a porous mineral that can hold more than 3 times its weight in water. Other popular choices are coconut coir and peat moss. These ingredients offer little to no nutrition to the fungus, but can help increase the field capacity of our substrate substantially without compromising aeration. Coconut coir is a particularly popular choice for mushroom cultivation because it's cheap, widely available, and very fibrous, giving the mycelium lots of structure to build on in addition to its remarkable water retention capabilities. There are special instruments specifically for testing soil moisture, but for our purposes, the best way to figure out your moisture content is just to use a good old-fashioned squeeze test. Just grab a handful and give it a good squeeze.
Moist soil.
When you squeeze, you want to see a few little rivulets of water running off. If it's dripping before you squeeze it, it's probably too wet. And if you have to really go for it to even get a few drops, then you probably need to add a little more. Coconut coir-based substrates can hold a lot of water and will really gush when you squeeze them. Sawdust and wood chips tend to hang on to their water a little bit more, and they also absorb it more slowly, which means that a substrate that felt a little too wet after cooking may actually come out too dry. Using hot or even boiling water will significantly speed the rate of absorption, and letting it soak overnight is a great way to make sure that your moisture content is dialed in. Over time, you'll get a real feel for it. Ultimately, a big part of this is just trial and error. Just like using different types of flour when you're making bread, different types of sawdust may absorb more or less water, so it's important to test each batch and have your own intuitive feel for the process. A batch of substrate may require several gallons of water, but the difference between it being too dry and too wet is often just a matter of a cup or two. So I always recommend starting with a safe amount of water, mixing it well, testing it, then adding a little bit, mixing it, testing it again, and so on. It's always easier to add more water than to take it out. Here's a tip that'll save you lots of time in the long run. I recommend keeping close records as you develop recipes. Rather than measuring the water 1 cup at a time, measure out a large amount and then add as much as you need little by little until you get it just right. Measure what you have left, and that'll give you a good benchmark for your future batches. That way, once you have your proportions really dialed for your specific recipe and ingredients, you can just measure, add, and go. After water, the next most important consideration for your substrate is the balance between carbon and nitrogen. Professor?
Along with the oxygen and hydrogen that make up water, carbon is the most fundamental building block of biological life. After that, the next most important, most essential ingredient is nitrogen! Every organism requires nitrogen to make very important things like proteins and DNA. Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen are found in abundance in a bioavailable form all throughout the biosphere. Nitrogen, on the other hand, though it composes a full 78% of our atmosphere, is almost entirely bound up in the extremely strong triple-bonded diatomic N2 molecule, which is functionally inert. Almost all of the bioavailable nitrogen throughout Earth's ecosystems is found in highly reactive compounds like ammonium and urea. These compounds are relatively unstable and react into less useful forms about as quickly as they're produced, which makes them relatively rare throughout the biosphere. As a result, this usable nitrogen is usually the most significant limiting growth ingredient for almost all living things, including plants, animals, and fungi. All living cells contain nitrogen, but in varying proportions. Wood, for example, is mostly made of lignin, which is a carbon-dominant biopolymer that very few things can digest. With their incredibly powerful suite of enzymatic tools, the mycelium of white rot fungi can access nitrogen stored deep in woody tissues that no other organisms can get access to. In fact, before the evolution of these very important organisms, all of the woody matter on Earth had nowhere to go, so it just piled up and piled up. Over lots of geologic time with lots of heat and pressure, these eventually became the deposits of carbon fuel that we've been running our civilization on. So it turns out fungi are to blame for the finitude of this important resource. However, though the mycelium is able to access and utilize the trace nitrogen stored in these woody tissues, building those mycelial pathways and all those enzymes requires nitrogen also. And this means that the fungus has to use a significant amount of its diet to continue growing and searching for more food. Therefore, just like using fertilizer to increase plant yields, adding a little bit more bioavailable nitrogen to your substrate will free up the fungus to put more of its biomass into reproduction, that is, growing the mushrooms. The trade-off is that by increasing the bioavailable nitrogen, we're also encouraging the growth of other organisms like bacteria that are specifically adapted to eating a lot really fast and reproducing as quickly as possible. The noble fungus, delicately weaving its hyphal tapestry, can be quickly surrounded and overwhelmed. So, in short, the more nitrogen we add to our substrate, the larger our potential yield, but also the more likely we are to run into problems with other microorganisms. This means that the more nitrogen we add, the more careful we have to be to maintain a completely sterile growing environment. Conversely, if we want to avoid the trouble of achieving total sterility, then we're going to be better off sticking with low nitrogen substrates. It's also worth mentioning that adding too much nitrogen can cause the fungus to grow too rapidly, generating enough metabolic heat to actually cook itself. Because they're the two most important basic chemical ingredients of our substrate, we usually measure nitrogen in relation to carbon. This is called the carbon to nitrogen ratio, abbreviated C to N. It's an important consideration in compost and soil building as well as substrate formulation. Fungi generally do better at a higher CN ratio than bacteria. Whereas the compost pile in your garden thrives at around 30 to 1, fungi generally prefer more like 50 or 60 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. Remember, the higher the number, the lower the nitrogen content. Soil testing laboratories can measure proportions exactly, but that's never necessary for our purpose. Nonetheless, I'll put a link in the description to a company that's a great resource for sending off substrate and soil samples for testing. If you really want to be a nerd about it, you can look up composting resources for CN ratios of various ingredients and get pretty accurate estimates just by doing a little bit of your own math. However, it's important to remember that these values will vary significantly from source to source, especially when working with manures, and that they're usually based on the dry weight, so the moisture content of your ingredients will complicate the equation significantly. So I say, don't bother straining yourself over inevitable inexactitudes. We're talking about poop and farm waste here. A general understanding of the relationship between carbon and nitrogen in your mushroom substrate is important, but what I want to encourage you to do is to trust your gut and follow your intuition. After all, I'm just some random guy on the internet.
Your fungus can tell you what it needs a lot better than anyone else can. And there's a very wide margin of tolerance. Following the recipes in this video will get you off to a great start, but the best way to dial in your mushroom substrate is to run controlled trials using the specific ingredients and mushroom varieties that you're actually working with. The main reason that I'm telling you all of this is because it's really important for you to understand which of your substrate ingredients are high in nitrogen. In compost jargon, we would divide our ingredients into two broad categories. We'd have the greens, which are higher in nitrogen, lower in carbon, and the browns, which are mostly carbon, low in nitrogen. For mushroom substrates, generally we start with the browns and then we add the greens to taste. However, if we add any nitrogen-rich ingredients at all, we're going to have to double down on sterility or rely on pasteurization and microbial symbiosis, which I'll explain in more detail when we talk poop later on. Poop! Browns in mushroom cultivation usually include things like sawdust, straw, wood shavings, cardboard, coconut coir. These all have a CN ratio of 100 to 1 or more. As for greens, the number one nitrogen source for many mushroom cultivation techniques is actually the grain itself. Other high nitrogen ingredients often include soy hulls, wheat bran, or various manures. Let me give you an example of why this is important. One of my very first mushroom cultivation experiments was to try to grow oyster mushrooms on pasteurized wheat straw in buckets in the garage. I heard about folks using coffee grounds as a mushroom substrate supplement, a resource that I have access to in great abundance. What I didn't realize is that coffee grounds, while brown in color, are considered a green compost ingredient with a CN ratio of 20 to 1, which is a fairly high source of nitrogen. Even though I sterilized the crap out of it beforehand, within about a week, all of my buckets were rife with a blue-green mold. What I learned was that to avoid this problem, I would have either needed to forgo the coffee altogether and just stick to the wheat straw and other low nitrogen ingredients, or take extra care to inoculate and incubate the coffee straw mixture under sterile conditions. I find that this is one of the most common issues for newcomers in mushroom cultivation. So, to reiterate, if we want to grow mushrooms with the highest biological efficiency and maximize yield, and we're doing it indoors in controlled environments, we're going to use high nitrogen substrates, and we're going to have to use pressure cookers and sterile culture technique to ensure sterility throughout the cultivation process. On the other hand, if we don't want to have to go through all that trouble, we need to make sure to stick to high carbon, low nitrogen substrates, and mostly we'll be working with pasteurization and other low input treatment methods. The other reason I'm telling you all this nitty-gritty about carbon-nitrogen ratios is just to help you make informed decisions as you modify and adjust your recipes. For example, if you want to switch a recipe that includes cow manure to use the chicken manure from your backyard, you're going to have to account for the fact that chicken manure contains on average about 3 times the nitrogen. The last thing I want to touch on before I move on from this nitrogen nerd out is the role that grains play in all of this. Grain is one of the most common ways to propagate mycelium for mushroom cultivation, and importantly, grain has a carbon-nitrogen ratio of usually around 15 to 1, which makes it a very high source of nitrogen, meaning that it must be sterilized, inoculated, and incubated under sterile conditions in order for it to work. The beauty of grain is that much of the nutrition lies in the inner pith, surrounded by a woody outer hull that mycelium can easily envelop and penetrate. Once the mycelium has completely enveloped or captured the kernel of grain, then it can be handled outside of a sterile environment with much lower risk of contamination, and all the while, the mycelium still has access to all of that nitrogen stored inside. This is why grain spawn is so useful for mushroom cultivation, and why many growing techniques rely on this function. By using high proportions of grain spawn, we can avoid using high nitrogen ingredients in our substrate, allowing us to make use of less sterile treatment techniques while avoiding the highest risk of contamination. This is what we're doing when we're using pasteurized wheat straw for oyster mushroom cultivation, or when we're only using coconut coir and vermiculite as the substrate for our dung-loving mushrooms. In these cases, almost all of the available nitrogen that's going to determine the final yield of our mushrooms comes from the grain itself, which we usually prepare by sterilizing it completely. Making your own grain spawn is easy and fun, and I have a deep dive video explaining the whole process. I'll also be explaining all of these techniques in greater detail in the roadmaps section of my upcoming video, Introduction to Mushroom Cultivation. So don't forget to subscribe so you get the update when that comes out. Another important consideration in formulating mushroom substrate is pH. That is, how acidic or alkaline the substrate is. Like many microbes, fungi tend to prefer neutral to slightly acidic environments. However, overall, they're more tolerant of a wider pH range than bacteria, which is why in alkaline soils and substrates, fungi tend to predominate. As they grow and consume nutrients, fungi tend to make their environment more acidic. This means that raising the pH of your substrate into the alkaline end of the spectrum will help give your fungus a head start. By the time it's neutralized or acidified its substrate, it will have already established itself well enough that it'll easily outcompete other microorganisms like the bacteria and yeast we're always trying to avoid. If we want to make really big pH adjustments, for example, if we're going to be cold pasteurizing our substrate for low-tech outdoor mushroom cultivation, a process I hope to go over in a future video, then we can raise the pH of the soaking water significantly by adding powerful alkalinizing agents such as wood ash or masonry lime. However, it's important to be aware that a little bit of these ingredients goes a long way, and if you add too much, you'll burn your substrate and your fungi won't grow. Overall, we want to use much gentler amendments, the most common of which is calcium sulfate, also known as gypsum. Rather than making a big pH adjustment, gypsum acts primarily as a buffer, gradually dissolving as the substrate becomes more acidic, helping to maintain a more neutral environment throughout the whole growing cycle. It also provides an abundant source of elemental sulfur and calcium, two important limiting growth factors for many of the enzymatic and biochemical tools that fungi need to grow and thrive. For large commercial mushroom farming operations, it's very useful to have an accurate and well-maintained soil pH meter, but for most of us that's total overkill, and just following recipes will get you more than close enough. You can also make use of cheap pH test strips by just squeezing a handful of substrate into a jar and then dipping the test paper into that liquid. Generally speaking, you want to aim for a pH around 7.5 to 8, just slightly on the alkaline side of the scale. Blah, blah, blah. The only time pH is really relevant is when you're formulating mushroom substrate recipes. For example, if I were to add chicken manure instead of cow manure to my recipe, like I mentioned earlier, I'm probably going to want to add just a dash of potash to offset the acidity of that chicken poop. Please, can we just move on? No, there's one more thing we need to talk about, and that is structure. Like most living things, fungi love a varied environment. A well-structured substrate includes lots of airspace for plenty of aerobic activity. It can retain lots and lots of moisture without ever getting soupy, and it's got a good balance of short-term and long-term nutrition. Mycelium, with its long, wispy, spindly fibers, is particularly well adapted to growing on fibrous material, which is why adding things like shredded cardboard, wheat straw, or coconut coir can create these nutrient superhighways that effectively allow the mycelium to build off of the existing lignin and cellulose infrastructure so that it doesn't have to build all of that from scratch. In other words, structuring your substrate with plenty of varied particle sizes and lots of fibrous material will lead to faster and more even growth overall than just using something simple like plain sawdust. Okay, let's recap. A perfect substrate has a good balance of water, carbon to nitrogen, a neutral to slightly alkaline pH, and plenty of structure. Now that we've covered these basics, we can finally move on to talking about some ingredients. In this video, I'll be walking you through my two favorite recipes, one for wood lovers and the other for dung and compost loving mushroom varieties. I'll give you a simple version and then a more complex and robust version of each of those. There is a lot of overlap between these methods, so I do recommend that you watch through both segments if you have the patience. First, I'll talk a little bit about the role of each of the ingredients, where to find them, and how to prepare them. As you'll see, I'll be mixing most of my substrate in my trusty concrete mixer here, lovingly nicknamed the Mangler. But before I could afford such a fine piece of state-of-the-art equipment, I always just mixed my substrate by hand in a large plastic tub. That worked just fine for me for years, and it will for you too. I also recommend measuring all of your ingredients by mass, so you're gonna want a trusty scale. Just a regular old postal scale will work, but a bathroom scale is not gonna be accurate enough. And one thing I just want to remind you about is we're going to be sterilizing all of this after the fact. So at this stage in the process, we can be real messy and it's not a problem. Oh, let's start with the wood lover recipe. This is the perfect choice for all of the culinary mushrooms that are easy to propagate and grow at home, such as lion's mane, oyster mushrooms, and shiitake. This is a good time to mention that many of the most prized mushrooms of all are actually mycorrhizal, meaning that they live in close partnership with tree roots and soil-dwelling microorganisms and are very difficult, though not necessarily impossible, to cultivate in a controlled environment. This includes the beloved morel, chanterelles, porcini, things like truffles. It's also worth mentioning that while none of these species are likely to produce mushrooms in a controlled environment, it is relatively easy to clone them and work with their mycelium. So if you're keen on those, the best bet is probably to try propagating them outdoors, which I'll cover in a future video. As you might guess, the main ingredient in our wood-lover substrate is wood. Specifically, we want to use hardwood sawdust. That's because the woods of conifer trees like spruce, fir, and pine have strong antifungal properties and are generally too resinous for mushroom cultivation. There are a few mushroom varieties that grow on conifers, like the hemlock reishi or the phoenix oyster. But generally speaking, most of the things we're interested in growing just won't take. Beyond that, a lot of folks make a lot of fuss about which types of mushrooms can grow on which specific types of hardwood. And though I know I'll probably get trashed by Fungus Dork 257 in the comments for saying this, I really don't think that it matters that much at all. In my experience, almost any type of wood-loving mushroom can adapt to almost any type of hardwood, though of course there are exceptions. And if you're going to be establishing a more dedicated cultivation plan, it's a good idea to run some trials beforehand. Pro tip, adding a little bit of your chosen sawdust to your agar media, liquid culture, or grain can help speed up this process of adaptation. Using softer hardwoods like alder and willow usually leads to faster growth, whereas denser woods like oak and maple take longer, but generally produce more over time. Birch, beech, ash, poplar, elm, and chestnut are great options. Worldwide, oak is probably the most popular choice for mushroom cultivation, but my personal preference is for alder. Alder is a fast-growing hardwood that's not particularly dense, and it's very easy to come by and abundant here in the Pacific Northwest. Plus, it supports the luxuriant growth of nearly every type of wood-loving mushroom I've ever tried. By far the most convenient source of hardwood sawdust, at least here in the United States, are hardwood fuel pellets, which are sold for use in meat smokers and pellet stoves. These pellets are usually made from the waste sawdust from sawmills, which means that the wood is first kiln dried before being hydraulically compressed. Therefore, these pellets are largely free of potential contaminants. In fact, some commercial growers simply hydrate them with boiling water and then inoculate them without any further sterilization. However, the efficiency of this technique is offset by the lower yields and slightly higher risks of contamination. Other great sources of hardwood sawdust are sawmills, carpentry shops, cabinet makers, artisan woodcrafters, and most of these folks are more than happy to give away their waste sawdust for free. However, using this as a source for mushroom cultivation does usually involve some additional considerations. For one thing, many of these sources mix and match wood types, so you don't necessarily know what you're getting, and it might include conifers. Also, sawdust from uncured wood or piles that have been left out in the rain can tend to become a real mold factory pretty quickly. If you're getting serious about mushroom cultivation, establishing a good relationship with a sawdust source can be very beneficial. Getting on a consistent pickup schedule makes their lives easier. It makes sure you get good clean sawdust, and in my experience, most of the folks who work closely with wood are very open-minded about fungus and happy to see their waste go to a good cause. Next, let's talk about adding some nitrogen. As I discussed earlier, if you're using low-tech methods, you're aiming for ease, and you're not particularly concerned with maximizing yield, you can use just plain old sawdust. This is especially a great approach for doing outdoor cultivation projects, like making sawdust spawn for outdoor beds. In this case, by using plenty of grain spawn, you can make sure that the mycelium has enough juice for the long haul. By avoiding nitrogen supplements, the risk of contamination is much lower, so you can get away with much more imperfect treatment methods and inoculating your substrate under less than sterile conditions. On the other hand, if we're aiming for big, bountiful mushroom harvests, then we're going to want to jack up the nitrogen to help increase yields and maximize our indoor controlled fruiting environment. However, this means that we'll want to sterilize it completely and use careful sterile techniques to avoid contamination. One of the most common choices for sawdust substrate, widely used throughout the mushroom cultivation industry, is called Master's Mix for Tim Masters, who came up with the recipe. It's dead simple: 50% oak sawdust, 50% soy hulls. The soybean hulls are a cheap agricultural byproduct that are relatively high in bioavailable nitrogen with a C/N ratio of about 30:1. Despite its overwhelming popularity, I personally do not recommend Master's Mix. In fact, I don't even like to eat mushrooms if there's a chance that they've been grown on this substrate, and I'll tell you why. Among all of the products of industrial agriculture, soy is particularly heavily contaminated with ever-increasing concentrations of poisonous agrochemicals. This is especially true with the widespread dissemination of Bayer's new dicamba-resistant GMO soy variety. Dicamba is an herbicide many times more persistent and pernicious than Roundup. It lingers in soil and water, and it even drifts into adjacent fields, forcing neighboring farmers to either convert to GMO or face bankruptcy. On top of that, pesticides, heavy metals, PFAS, and other toxins bioaccumulate most heavily in the hulls and the stems of the plant. Subsequently, when the mycelium eats this, it concentrates those toxins in the mushrooms themselves. Paradoxically, research has showed that fungi are actually some of the best tools for bioremediating these toxins both in the soil and in our bodies. But, and I might catch some flack from SoyLover239 in the comments for saying this, I think it's wildly irresponsible to sell gourmet mushrooms that are grown on anything other than organic substrates. I'll include a link in the description for a reputable source for Master's Mix, but I want to just note that even what we call organic agriculture still relies heavily on the industrial monocrop techniques that lead to many of these bioaccumulation and soil degradation problems, albeit hopefully less severe. More than I want to scare you away from anything, I just want to encourage you to be informed and discerning about what you feed your fungi. In the grand scheme, perhaps it makes little difference, and chances are your mushrooms are still going to grow and taste absolutely delicious. But I do believe that all these little incremental shifts in our perspectives and in our nutrient pathways do eventually add up to a significant change. Like I said earlier, if you are what you eat, then you are also what you eat eats. I say, may we mushroom cultivators be the vanguard in rectifying the malfeasance of systemic global agrochemical sterilization. Next to soy hulls, the other most popular nitrogen supplement for commercial mushroom cultivation is wheat bran. The bran is the protective outer layer of the wheat kernel. When refining wheat to make white flour, the bran and the germ are removed. This byproduct has loads of fiber and a C/N ratio of about 15:1, which makes it a perfect ingredient for supplementation in mushroom substrates, especially if you can find it on the cheap. Just like with soy, wheat is often heavily treated, so in my opinion, going organic is a must. A typical supplementation ratio is around 9 or 10%, or 1 part bran, about 10 parts sawdust and wood chips. Another great nitrogen supplement, which you can usually get for free, is spent coffee grounds. Most cafes and coffee roasteries churn out buckets of coffee grounds every day, and they're happy to see it disappear. Coffee is one of the most biochemically complex plants in the world and offers an incredible abundance of minerals and other trace nutrients in addition to a relatively high nitrogen content with a C/N ratio of about 20:1. While coffee is acidic, the grounds are usually quite neutral. The main caveat with using coffee grounds is that they're usually fully saturated with water and then left to sit around for a while, becoming fodder for a whole universe of different saprophytic molds and bacteria. From a purely compost-oriented perspective, this is a beautiful thing to witness, but most mushroom cultivators will wince when they see clouds of trichoderma spores wafting from the pile. Not to worry though, adequate sterilization will make this a perfect, beautiful substrate. Another substrate supplement I get asked about a lot are spent brewery grains. When making beer, large amounts of barley are milled and then mashed and then discarded. So most brewers are more than happy to let you have their waste for free. Like many broke but enthusiastic mushroom cultivators, when I first started out, I thought for sure this was going to be my ticket to massive amounts of mushrooms at almost no cost. What I found early on is that the residual sugars and then this porridge-like texture of the mashed grain becomes a real bacteria factory. Because this comes out of the lauter tun fully saturated and quite warm, it basically begins fermenting almost immediately. So unfortunately, brewery grains will not work as a substitute for your grain spawn. However, it's a perfectly adequate, wonderful nitrogen supplement for your sawdust substrate recipes. I also find in general that most brewers, while they're willing to let you have whatever they have lying around, they don't have a lot of time to spare for you, so getting on a consistent pickup schedule really helps. And that, again, is where you're gonna have to make sure you've got a good use for these. Otherwise, they're probably better off just going to the pigs. You'll have to calculate to compensate for the moisture content, but you can use it in place of your wheat bran in your sawdust recipe at a 1-to-1 substitution. However, you're going to need to get to it right away every time, or else you're basically just going to have a giant pile of stinky, rotting grain lying around. So it really only makes sense, in my opinion, if you're a commercial producer who's operating on a large enough scale to make use of this resource rapidly and very consistently. Listen, I know this has been a long-winded segment, but before I move on, there's one more thing to talk about. Poop! Now, I'll get more into the ins and outs of poop in the next segment on compost and dung-loving mushroom substrates, but it's worth mentioning that various manures can also make a suitable nitrogen supplement for wood-lover recipes as well. However, in my experience, it's important to be sparing and judicious in its use, as poop can be a challenging source of biochemical complexity for fungi that are not particularly adapted to it. Many different types of poop can work, but for wood lovers, I think it's more important to use well-composted manures. How much you use will depend on many factors, including the type of manure and its level of decomposition. I tend to reserve my grazing animal manures for my dung-loving substrates, but there is one type of poop that I particularly enjoy including in my wood-lover recipes, and that is worm castings. Worms are prolific soil builders and mycosymbionts, and their poop is a particularly rich source of trace minerals and micronutrients, in addition to plenty of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. I use well-aged organic worm castings from my local cannabis cultivation supplier. Better yet, if you're in the market for yet another involved hobby, vermiculture is a beautiful and accessible way to close nutrient loops. Even if you live in an apartment, you can keep a worm farm in a small plastic tub, and they'll happily gobble up all your kitchen scraps in no time with no unpleasant odor. Not only can you use their castings in your garden and mushroom substrates, but worms love mycelium, so you can feed them the spent blocks at the end. The big thing with using worm castings or any other type of manure with your wood-loving mushrooms is that these fungi are not adapted to that particular food source, and so they need some time to figure out what the heck that stuff is. Still, it's really pretty amazing to see how quickly the fungi can adapt to something so foreign. But if you want to scale this up, it's important to train your fungus on the poop that you're going to be using before you throw it into full-scale production. Adding a little pinch of your chosen manure to your agar recipe, liquid culture, and your grain spawn will significantly cut down on your incubation times later on. All right, you've been so patient sitting through all this information overload. It's finally time to get to the part that you came for, the actual recipes. First, let's start off with a very simple, easy, straightforward wood-lover substrate recipe we'll just mix in a plastic tub. After that, I'll show you a little bit more complicated version that I prefer. But first, I want you to see just how easy it can be. For this, we're just going to stick with 4 basic ingredients: some hardwood fuel pellets, some wheat bran, gypsum, and some filtered spring water. Like I said earlier, we'll want to heat our water first so that the pellets absorb it quickly. So we'll start there. For this recipe, I'm going to use about 3 liters of water, and I'm going to save a little bit to the end just to make sure that we don't add too much. Next, I'll weigh out 1,000 grams of my favorite mushroom kibble, alder fuel pellets. Then I've already weighed out about 200 grams of organic wheat bran and 100 grams of food-grade gypsum powder. Both gypsum and bran tend to clump quite a bit when you add the water, so it's important to get it mixed thoroughly beforehand. Or, in some cases, what I'll do is just add the gypsum to the water first and stir it in before I pour. Now we'll set that aside to soak for at least an hour or 2 so that it cools down enough to touch. Or you could just let it soak overnight.
Once it's cooled enough to handle, mix the substrate thoroughly, making sure to get anything that might be stuck in the corners. After one full mix, give it a good squeeze. If it feels dry and there's barely any water dripping off, you can add a little more, but just a little at a time. Sprinkle it across the surface, mix thoroughly, and squeeze it again before adding too much more. The difference between too dry and too wet is often just a splash.
Once you've got the substrate to full field capacity, you're ready to bag it up. The vast majority of us use unicorn bags, which are specialized mushroom bags with sterile air filters. Check the description for some links. Jars work fine too, especially for grain spawn, but are too small to be worthwhile for bulk substrate like this. It's possible to make do with some DIY substitutes like buckets or pots, but these are really better suited to low nitrogen, non-sterile, and outdoor cultivation techniques, which I'll talk more about in a future video. For a supplemented sawdust substrate like this, it's really hard to beat the efficacy of a properly sealed, filtered mushroom bag. Opinions vary on how much substrate to add to each bag. Many growers try to operate at the upper limit, which is about 10 pounds, filling their bags as full as possible, as this feels like a more efficient approach for inoculation. However, the larger the block, the more energy is required for sterilization. Large bags of nitrogen-rich substrate can lead to too much thermal gain during spawn run, and the mycelium is more likely to cook itself. A larger number of smaller bags means more surface area for faster and more complete use of the available nutrients, allowing for faster harvests and tighter turnaround in the grow room. Plus, if there are problems with contamination, smaller bags reduce the loss rate. I've found that, for my purposes, the sweet spot is usually somewhere between 4 and 6 pounds of substrate per bag. Check out my deep dive video on pressure cookers and sterilization for more details on how to work with grow bags. And subscribe and click the bell to stay tuned for upcoming videos about all-in-one bags, mass inoculation, building a grow room, and lots more.
Now that simple recipe is a great place to start, but if you're serious about fungus, I think it's well worth taking a few extra steps to help you increase yield, decrease incubation times, and improve the overall nutrition, flavor, and medicinal benefit of the mushrooms you're going to be growing. So, to reward you for watching this far, I'm going to show you my favorite top secret gourmet mushroom recipe for wood lovers. I've been tinkering with this recipe quite a lot over the last few years to get it really dialed in. This recipe is designed to perfectly fill my 41-quart All-American sterilizer and makes 8 bags at about 4 pounds each. I'll be mixing all of this in a plastic tub and letting it soak to make sure it gets fully saturated before dumping it in the mixer.
It's too much, man. You took too much.
We'll start by heating 12 quarts of water. We'll weigh the alder pellets first so that they're at the bottom and make sure they get fully saturated. For this recipe, we'll use 3,000 grams. I'm also going to add about 200 grams of hardwood shavings, and 500 grams or about half a bucket of shredded wheat straw. And of course, we're going to want to use some OMRI listed horticultural grade coarse vermiculite to increase our field capacity.
Morning.
How about 2 quarts? I also always like to add a little bit of coconut coir for the same purpose. We'll do about 2 quarts of that too. Next up, let's add some nitrogen. For this recipe, I always use a combination of organic wheat bran and organic worm castings. We'll start with 250 grams of bran, plus about 200 grams of worm castings. Make sure to get the clumps. And finally, 250 grams of sifted gypsum. Gotta get those clumps. Gotta get those clumps. Get the clumps. And to boost the pH a little bit, I'll be using just a pinch of potash from my wood stove. Next, we'll do some gentle mixing by hand so that we make sure to get the clumps. And by now, I bet our water is hot and ready to pour.
quick side note. The conventional approach to mushroom cultivation is to inoculate sawdust blocks using mature grain spawn. This usually involves free pouring the grain spawn into the open sawdust bags in front of a flow hood. This leaves a lot of room for error and is generally the most contamination-prone step in the whole mushroom cultivation process. I want to propose an alternative. What I like to do instead is add the grain to the sawdust bag first, then seal it and wait to make sure it remains sterile before I inoculate it directly with a liquid culture syringe. The mycelium rips through the grain layer, and then it's ready to break it up and mix the whole block. Within about 2 weeks, it's fully enveloped in mycelium and ready for the fruiting chamber. This method increases production efficiency significantly while also minimizing contamination risk. These are known as all-in-one bags, and they form the foundation of the most advanced streamlined approach to commercial gourmet mushroom production. This method is also ideal for hobby growers who don't have access to a laminar flow hood for making reliably sterile spawn transfers, which is why I also use these as the basis for all of my Wood-Lover grow kits. It's relatively easy to make your own at home simply by adding a layer of soaked grain to the top of your substrate bag. The caveat is that grain can get overcooked and break down during the longer sterilization times required for sawdust. While this isn't a deal breaker for the home grower, if you're a commercial cultivator who's here looking for some insider secrets, I can tell you from extensive experimentation that the only way to make a truly perfect all-in-one bag is to sterilize the grain and the substrates separately and then add them together under the flow hood. Because everything is freshly sterilized, you eliminate the risk of potential contaminants riding on the outside of jars and bags. Mixing the grain after the fact ensures that you can prepare it properly and that all of the kernels stay intact. Plus, it allows you to create a good amount of atmosphere in your bags, which makes mixing easier and helps accelerate growth rates. After the substrate and grain are mixed, the bags can be sealed and then stored for several days or even months, during which time, if there were any problems, contaminants would appear and you would be able to avoid wasting any inoculum. The sealed bags can then simply be inoculated using liquid culture syringes, or better yet, as I'll show you in an upcoming video, you can use Remus, the remarkably efficient mass inoculation system.
Hey man, what's with all this gourmet mushroom business? I thought we were going to talk about the other kind, man.
I snugly nib on you.
Well, at this point, I've been going on and on for days about field capacity and soil chemistry, pH, moisture content, and all you wanted was a dang recipe. Well, here you go. This is by far the most popular substrate recipe in the hobby mushroom community, and it's very easy to remember, and it works. Plus, it has almost no nitrogen and very little nutrition overall, so you can use it with very low risk of contamination. However, of course, that also means that the nutrition that's going to produce those bountiful harvests of mushrooms is going to have to come predominantly from the grain spawn. No mushroom substrate video would be complete without talking about CVG, which stands for coir, vermiculite, and gypsum, the 3 ingredients. So here it is: 1 650-gram brick of coconut coir, 2 quarts of coarse vermiculite, and 1 cup of gypsum. Plus, you'll need about 4.5 quarts of water, which you heat to close to a boil, and you'll need something to mix it in, and probably a spoon so you don't burn yourself. Back in the dark ages, in the 90s and early 2000s, when dung-loving mushroom cultivation was solely the business of the brave and the foolish, one of the most reliable sources for coconut coir were these small bricks sold at pet supply stores as animal bedding. So that's why this is the basis of the recipe. Nowadays, at least in this part of the world, cannabis and garden supply stores routinely stock 5-kilogram bricks of compressed coir at a much better price. Make sure to look for organic certified or OMRI listed coir if you can find it. When you add hot water, the coir will expand and break apart. A small brick will expand pretty easily, but a larger brick may leave dry, untouched patches in the middle. It's much more challenging to break these up after the fact, so in my opinion, it'll save you a little time to break it apart beforehand. My preferred method is to use a large plastic storage container and a hammer. I used to use a chisel, but counterintuitively a hammer works much better. You want to hit it on the ends to break it apart into leaves before you smash these into smaller pieces, ideally no bigger than about the size of a fist.
These days, many outfits sell loose coir in bags. However, I recommend getting these hydraulically compressed bricks if you can find them. The bags are partially hydrated in order to break apart the coir, but you never know exactly how much, so that'll skew your moisture ratio, meaning that you have to fine-tune your recipe every batch. Plus, it'll increase the chances of contamination, especially with cobweb mold. So you're also going to have to pasteurize it longer if you want to make that work.
Start with just the coconut coir so you can make sure that it gets fully hydrated. Add it to your bucket or mixing bin, and then pour a large amount of the water over the top. Cover it and let it soak for about 10 minutes or so it can fully expand. Next, give it a light stir to make sure that there aren't any dry, untouched patches in the middle, and add a little more water if necessary. Now add the vermiculite, gypsum, and any remaining water to the bucket, and mix the whole thing together. I recommend mixing the dry vermiculite and gypsum, as this will help prevent the gypsum from clumping up. I also recommend sifting it, as sometimes it's already a bit clumpy just right out of the bag. Try to give it a thorough mix from top to bottom. Then, you'll simply cover it and let it sit.
I want to pause here and talk about something really important. The bucket tech that I'm describing is by far the easiest and the most common method for preparing small batches of bulk substrate. But there's a catch. Vermiculite and gypsum are just minerals, and coconut coir is basically just plain old carbon with a C/N ratio of 100:1 or higher. Like we discussed earlier, this means that there's very little nutrition to feed pathogens or competing microorganisms, and total sterility is unnecessary. Simple pasteurization is enough. The idea with this method is that the boiling water will actually heat the substrate enough to lightly pasteurize it. For this method to work though, it's important to keep the substrate as hot as possible for as long as possible. Many people suggest wrapping the bucket in some towels. Or better yet, you can mix the whole thing in a small beverage cooler. It's also particularly important to use clean, dry coir when you're using this process. Granted, bucket tech works the majority of the time, but in my opinion, if you've already gone through the trouble of sourcing genetics, inoculating your spawn, incubating it for weeks, it really burns to get to that final stage only to lose a whole batch because your coir wasn't adequately pasteurized. Remember, the number one contamination vector is always just the raw material itself. I highly recommend that you cook your substrate a little longer than just a boiling water soak, and why not just go for a full run of pasteurization? I would say the bare minimum, in my opinion, is around 4 to 6 hours at temperature, but just to play it safe, I always go for a full 24 hours at 190 degrees Fahrenheit.
If you're just doing one small batch, say for a single monotub, a great method is to use a crock pot or an instant pot and leave the substrate in it overnight on the keep warm setting. If you're making a larger quantity, you'll need a pasteurizer of some kind. And you'll want to bag the substrate first to make it more manageable and to ensure that it cooks evenly. Since you're not pressure cooking it, regular food storage bags work fine for this. Though I do recommend using the more heat-tolerant polypropylene bags that are designed for this purpose. The simplest way to build a pasteurizer is to use a soup pot, like a big vegetable steamer, and make a rack of some kind that fits on the bottom to keep the contents out of the water. If you're trying to bulk up, you can build a much bigger version using a trash can or a 55-gallon drum. This is called a bulk pasteurizer, which I describe in more detail in my pressure cooker video. Whatever option you choose, you'll want to stagger the bags as you load it and leave lots of room for steam to pass around them. Add plenty of water and check it every few hours to make sure it doesn't boil dry.
Now, there's certainly something to be said for keeping it simple and sticking to the tried and true, but CVG
doesn't have everything the body needs.
Many of us, once we've got a taste for the basics, crave something more out of life. We want to elevate our approach and attain to the cosmic mysteries of the venerable dung-loving fungi. That's right, you guessed it. It's time for the part that you really came for,
It's time to talk about
Poop!
Many grazing animals have a built-in bioreactor that's separate from the stomach, where plant cellulose can be digested and fermented into bioavailable carbohydrates. This is called the rumen. The rumen is a complex, biodiverse, singular microbiological ecosystem that contemporary biology has only begun to unravel. What secret force is that which dwells within? What are the true mysteries of these thermophilic bacteria and these chytrid cryptids, turning plant fiber into the sweet, sweet nectar of the underworld? Now, it doesn't take a coprophilic ethnozoologist to surmise that there are ancient and complex mutualistic interdependencies between manure fertilization, plant microbiomes, soil ecology, these cud-sucking milk machines, and the human beings who have relied on their milk, meat, and manure since before humans could even say the words synthetic anthropogenic nitrogenous urea. Other herbivorous Other herbivorous quadrupeds, like horses, donkeys, and elephants, have different but similarly biologically complex hindguts where all of this fermentation magic happens. Humans know comparatively little about these gastric microbiomes, but one thing is certain: fungi know all about them. Could it be mere coincidence that many of the mushroom varieties most influential in human culture arise from the lowly dung heaps of our most sacred beasts? Before the beginning of the global trade of saltpeter, and subsequently the development of the Haber-Bosch process for industrial ammonia synthesis, which is arguably the single most consequential technical development in human history, poop was one of the most valuable and finite resources on Earth. That's because it's a potent fertilizer that contains all of the basic building blocks of life, including significant amounts of nitrogen. Before modern sanitation, poop collection, especially in urban areas, was actually a booming industry. To sustain the level of intensive agriculture needed to feed rapidly growing human populations, everything had to be recycled, and nary a turd was wasted. Nowadays, however, we're more likely to regard this precious resource as a nuisance and an encumbrance. Of course, most of us are civilized enough to enjoy the luxury of pooping in the drinking water in the comfort of our own homes, floating it on private underground rivers into giant slurry tanks where the sludge can then be filtered out and buried in toxic concentrations, and the partially denitrified runoff can then be dumped in the river. By comparison, the thought of collecting and using that waste in our gardens and farms sounds downright barbaric. During the Green Revolution and the advent of global industrial agriculture, it's no coincidence that the widespread adoption of synthetic fertilizers coincided with the rise of the industrial mushroom cultivation industry. Pig farmers, in particular, were facing a real problem as the poop was starting to really pile up. So as all good people do in times of crisis, they turned to fungi for help, specifically the compost-loving agaricus mushrooms that had long been a mainstay in France. Even now, the vast majority of industrially cultivated mushrooms sold at grocery stores in the US are all just cultivars of a single species of agaricus bred for just this purpose. But I digress. For our purposes, this general cultural disregard of poop means that there's usually an abundance to be gleaned for free, especially if you're willing to pick up a shovel. But not just any poo will do. As with all aspects of this fungal alchemy, fortune will favor the diligent and the discerning.
And if you're just hopelessly lost at sea, far from fertile fields, remember, you can always just call on your good friend Captain Blogar over at fungaia.life for a treasure chest full of precious doubloons, lovingly pasture-foraged, hand-picked, properly aged, and then dried, shredded, sifted, winnowed, fermented, and slow-cooked to perfection, delivered right to your door via the trusty U.S. mail. Yarr.
As I'll discuss in detail shortly, a small amount of manure can actually make a lot of substrate. So the idea here is quality over quantity. Many different types of dung can work for this. Me personally, I'm a donkey do kind of guy. But horse and cow manure are probably the easiest to come by, and if you can get it, elephant dung is the clear preference of many of the prolific and delightful mushroom varieties of South Asia. In theory, the poop of any herbivore is a worthwhile candidate for mushroom cultivation. I foresee a whole cottage industry of boutique turd herders offering unique and exotic manures from all over the world, from Himalayan pika to Galapagos tortoise. Perhaps more important than the animal that it comes from is the food that that animal eats. Many livestock are raised primarily on grain, alfalfa, and other chemical-laden monocrops, which give them indigestion, and it shows on the other end. The hallmark of a true manure connoisseur is a keen nose for organic, pure, pasture-fed poop. No doubt there are many cryptic biochemical processes at work here, but one thing is very clear. The undigested raw plant material, the fiber that makes it out into the final manure, is an important part of the structure of the fungal substrate.
In my experience, the best poop is to be found in the early to mid-summer, when the grazers have been graced with the gastric delights of the pure, verdant, fresh tendrils of a spring.
If you're out scat scouting, keep your eyes open for animals with long, shaggy pastures with lots of plant variety. That's where you're going to find the happiest bellies and thus the choicest of poops.
Now take it from this crusty old dung dangler. There's a time for poo pirates, and there's a time for poo parley. Before you just go knocking on doors, maybe you think about bringing a flagon of ale or offering to do a little yard work. Yard.
All right, let's go treasure hunting. This is good untreated pasture. As you can see, these donkeys have plenty of fodder, so they get to be nice and picky. There are a few nice looking piles around here, but mostly I'm gonna have to just go foraging around in the grass, see what I can scare up, and we'll see how much we have at the end. Thankfully, we don't need a lot. We're really mostly interested in the microorganisms that are present in this. Just a little bit goes a long way. All right, this is the good stuff right here. This is what we want. It's dried out. It's had ground contact, so it's been able to decompose. It's in the sun, so it's nice and dry. It smells clean. Doesn't even really smell like manure at all. This is perfect. Pure gold right here. I'll be lucky to fill a wheelbarrow with this. That's okay. Quality, not quantity, that matters here. These aren't working animals, so their feed isn't supplemented heavily. They've got plenty of pasture. Loose bits in here, you know, just leaves and maybe some weed seeds and that kind of thing. I might sort it a little bit, but for the most part that stuff will be okay. We're going to compost it, and then we're going to dry it, and then we're going to shred it, and then we're going to pasteurize it. So a little bit of loose matter, a little bit of dirt, it's never going to hurt anybody. Just a man outstanding in the field. Depending on how long your poops have been left out to pasture, you may want to let them compost for a few weeks after you bring them home. There's no real rule here, but in general I've found that I have more consistent results with at least partially composted manure. Despite what some people may tell you, this really doesn't require anything special. Really, you could just heap it in a pile. Giving it ground contact will significantly speed the composting process, and managing moisture is helpful too. I find that throwing a tarp over the mound to protect it from the sun and rain, and then leaving it be for a season usually works wonders. If you can easily crumble up a turd in your hand and you don't notice any strong smell, I'd say it's probably just about there. There's really no need to let the manure break down completely. At that point, much of its mojo's been denitrified back into the biosphere. Once you're confident that your poop is sufficiently chilled out, you can go ahead and use it straight away in your substrate. But if you want to preserve it for later, I recommend that you dry it out first. To dry my manure, I spread it on a pallet, which I screwed some sides on and covered in a mesh, also known as hardware cloth. I'll let it sit this way, covered from the rain, for however long it takes, and once it's thoroughly dry, it can be stored in bins or barrels indefinitely. Now, as I'll discuss shortly, manure really works best when it's well integrated with another non-nutritive substrate ingredient, like coconut coir. For best results, I find it's important to crumble up the individual turds and mix them thoroughly with the substrate. Otherwise, the concentrated little pockets of poop can cause uneven growth during spawn run, which will lead to a lopsided pin set and a lower likelihood of a full canopy flush. If you're just making small batches, it's really no trouble to crumble the dry manure by hand and sift it through some coarse mesh as you go. For larger quantities though, I've become a big fan of the quality and the consistent results that I get by running the manure through my yard debris shredder. I use a custom outfeed chute, a steel drum, and some burlap sacks from the coffee roaster as a filter to keep from blowing
Gold all over the place.
Once it's all shredded down, the poop can be stored in the drum, staying dry and dormant until it's ready to be coaxed back to life for the fungi, in true alchemical fashion, to turn this humble base matter into pure metaphysical gold.
Okay, now that we have our perfectly prepared poop, it's time to make some substrate. Now, it's certainly possible to grow your mushrooms on nothing but pure manure. After all, that's how they evolved in the first place. I've experimented with this somewhat, and I will say that it does have advantages. For one thing, I've never had so many consecutive flushes from a single crop. There is also a noticeable difference in the character and quality of the mushrooms themselves. Nonetheless, I really don't think it's practical overall to grow on pure manure. For one thing, it takes the mycelium at least 4 or 5 times longer to grow through the substrate. Managing moisture is a lot more challenging, and overall, even though I would say my total final yield was a lot higher, my yield per flush was considerably lower than using the techniques that I'm going to describe next. I've also run experiments on the other end of the spectrum, starting with CVG and just adding small amounts of manure. Running the same strain alongside some manure-free controls, I found overall that those with manure outperformed those without at a pretty significant margin. What surprised me though was that the ones that did the very best were the ones with only about 10 to 15% manure by mass. One of the main things that these substrate experiments made very clear to me was that the real benefit of adding manure to our substrate isn't in the nutrition, though that is important, it's in the microbiome. Essentially, we're just inoculating our substrate with the microorganisms from the poop. This is why complete sterilization of our substrate is actually detrimental, and pasteurization is by far the better option. If we sterilize our manure completely, not only are we losing the benefit of all of those thermophilic bacteria and other microbes, we're also leaving a relatively nitrogen-rich environment completely open to opportunistic microorganisms. On the other hand, when we're composting the manure, a lot of that work is being done by other fungi like blue-green molds. So if we don't pasteurize it or heat treat it at all, the spores of those fungi are going to have first dibs and contamination rates are going to be relatively high. Pasteurization cooks most of these things out, but the heat-tolerant thermophilic bacteria from the rumen or the hindgut of those grazing animals can hang with the heat. One of the coolest things about working with properly pasteurized manure-based substrates is that because it already has a fairly significant microbial population, it's very resistant to contamination. Of course, you still need to make sure that your grain spawn is fully developed and that there aren't any untouched grains going into your substrate, and you need to keep your temperature in check. I would say those are probably the 2 most common causes of mold in my experience. But overall, even if you have moisture issues or maybe weak genetics, the benevolent poop is a lot more forgiving than just working with CVG alone. So we have our poop, and now we have a proportion. Next up, let's make a large batch of CVG following the same proportions as that smaller recipe, and then add in a little bit of our precious poop.
As always with CVG, I like to start with the broken up coconut coir and pour in about 3/4 of the water to let it fully expand. I'll tumble it a time or two and then cover it and let it sit a while as the water's absorbed.
Just like my pappy always says,
Get the clumps!
just one more minute.
Next, I'll sift the gypsum into the vermiculite and mix it thoroughly.
The clumps!
Then I'll add this to the mixer a little bit at a time, as well as most of the remaining water to rinse down the sides, and then I'll let that mix for a few minutes. I'll pause periodically to break up any clumps, and usually also stop halfway through to scrape off anything that's been clinging to the sides of the mixer.
Time to play my favorite game, catch the tumbling clumps.
Don't get mangled! The mangler! The clumps don't stand a chance!
Now I'll weigh out some of my precious poop. Manure, when moistened, gets very sticky. Yet another historical use of this remarkable substance was as an additive to earth and plaster to increase adhesion. If I add the poop straight to the mixer, it will quickly begin forming little balls like those made by dung beetles, and I'll be stuck clump crumbling until I'm poo in the face.
Maximum poop inhalation.
Instead, I weigh enough manure to equal about 15% of the total dry weight of the substrate, and dump it in a bucket. Then I add a few handfuls of the CVG and mix it by hand. A little more CVG, a little more mixing. And finally, I'll add this to the mixer, one handful at a time, so it gets incorporated well in minimal time to avoid clumping. I'll rinse off the rim of the mixer with the last little splash of water, let it turn once or twice, and then dump it into a bin for bagging. This is a great time to double check the water content and make sure the substrate has reached field capacity. I'll do a few squeeze tests, checking both the bottom and the top of the bin.
Ooh, juicy. Juicy poopy. Now I know you're probably chomping at the bit to get growing, and you can go ahead and cook your substrate right away, and it'll probably work just fine. But I will say, if you have the time and the patience, I really recommend that you let it sit for a while and allow it to ferment. I've found that even a day or two makes a noticeable difference, and I know some growers who absolutely swear that a minimum of 2 weeks is necessary, especially if you're interested in growing some of the more exotic dung lovers. Allowing your substrate to sit, to ruminate, if you will, leads to faster mycelial growth, higher potential yields, shorter fruiting cycles, and reportedly more elevated final results. You can trust me, I'm some guy on the internet.
Whether you decide to go for the fermentation or not, the next step is pasteurization. As I've said, I recommend running your substrate for a full 24 hours at least 190 degrees Fahrenheit. The substrate is ready to get bagged up. Just like the sawdust, I like to keep the bags fairly small to ensure even heating during pasteurization. These are the substrate bags I use for my all-in-one cube kits, so even if they're ultimately destined for a monotub, I still like to put them into these specialized high airflow spawn bags that are designed for mushroom fruiting. That way, we can just dump in some mature grain spawn, mix it directly in the bag, and watch the magic happen. Not only is this a great method for beginners, it's also a very efficient technique for scaling up. Check out my video, How to Grow Mushrooms the Easy Way, for a quick walkthrough of this technique. As I mentioned earlier, you can pasteurize small amounts of substrate in an instant pot or a crock pot on the keep warm setting. For medium-sized batches, you can use a soup pot with a rack in the bottom. And for large amounts, you can build a bulk pasteurizer. For years, I pasteurized my bag substrate in a 55-gallon drum that I modified for just this purpose. I talk about this in more detail in my pressure cooker video. It's a great cheap solution, but it does require a little more attention, and it uses nearly a full tank of propane every time you want to run it. Now that I have these big automated sterilizers, I can just program them to run at a low enough temperature for pasteurization. Since these are bags I'm selling to customers, I want them to be perfect, so I generally unload, cool, and seal them under laminar flow. But unlike with grain spawn, manure-based substrate tends to naturally resist contamination, so if you don't have a flow hood, you can just let the bags cool naturally inside of the pasteurizer with very little concern. Once your substrate has cooled to at least body temperature, you're ready to spawn it with your mature grain spawn and watch as the magic unfolds.
Wow, you made it all the way through! Thanks so much for watching, folks. I hope this video has been fun, helpful, and informative, and given you the confidence to continue deepening your exploration of the wonderful world of DIY mushroom cultivation. Make sure to go check out our other videos for anything you might need to know about how to grow your own mushrooms from scratch at home. And of course, subscribe and stay tuned, because we've got lots more great content in the works. My name is Paul Lynn, and I'm a true believer in the power of fungi to help catalyze change and guide us toward a more healthy, sustainable, loving, and tender relationship to this sacred earth, our home. Fungi are exemplars of mutualistic and even altruistic symbiosis, and they have so much to teach us. I have long held the belief that these living processes hold the key to solving many of humanity's most insoluble problems. And so I also believe that free education is one of the most important tools in our collective quest for a sustainable future. This is why I've devoted myself to pursuing a life dream of a free school and started Fungaia as a big part of what will help make that happen. So remember, if you're not quite ready to take the plunge into making your own substrate, you can always order some from my donation-based shop at fungaia.life. It's lovingly handmade with high-quality organic ingredients, top-shelf turds, and supporting my work goes a long way to helping me chase my dream and continue to create fun, free educational videos like this one. And whether you're an experienced cultivator or you're just getting started for the first time, do yourself a favor and go check out our friends over at truebluegenetics.org. They make the cleanest, densest, most vigorous liquid culture on the market, and they have a huge rotating selection of proven, isolated fungal genetics. It's clear that they care about their craft and they really put their hearts into their work. Plus, they have super reasonable prices and a scholarship program. And when you do, make sure that you also use the top secret coupon code LOVEPOOP to get yourself an extra 20% off and to help support the channel. Plus, we'll make sure that they throw in a little extra surprise reserved only for the true poo believers. I see you out there, my kindred earth tenders in service. To you, I tip my hat. Keep on mucking. Much love.
Poop.